Welcome, everyone. The Costume Society of America thanks you for joining our Conversations on Dress web panel series that serves as a place to discuss issues in dress studies that promote ideas around diversity. You can find the other installments of the series on our website and YouTube on various topics around diversity. I'm delighted to welcome you and to be your host today. My name is Jenny Lee Dupuis, and I am a PhD candidate at Cornell University, focusing on apparel design, and I'm a volunteer with the CSA Conversations on Dress series. As a member of the Goth and EDM subcultures myself, I am particularly excited for today's panel discussion, Subculture Style Innovation. The topic for this panel is diversity and inclusivity within studies of dress as panelists consider the realm of music and youth-oriented subcultures and related communities. From Goth to Rave, Lolita to mod, and beyond, subculture often relates to the fashion cycle ahead of the curve and can also push beyond its limits. There's a fascinating push-pull between outsider lifestyles driving innovative design and the subsequent impact on wider mass culture, and the complicated use of subcultural imagery, silhouettes and ensembles or body modifications that represent shared lived experiences in the margins. Influenced by their vast knowledge of the history of these styles, the experts on this panel have designed, published, and exhibited, sharing a concern to preserve the stories and artifacts of seemingly familiar styles that have as yet lacked substantial chronicling of their origin stories and designers. There is vast intersectionality in studying subculture where women, BIPOC, and LGBTQIA+ communities have been actively involved, but those stories are often not the first documented or recorded when studying this area, and thus there exists tremendous potential for this field to grow. CSA's goal is to discuss some of these issues and examine some examples of good practices within our field. Let's welcome our moderator for today. Dr. Monica Sklar is an assistant professor of fashion history and merchandising and is the coordinator of the Historic Clothing and Textiles Collection at the University of Georgia. She also serves as Costume Society of America's Vice President for Technology and is co-principal of Blue Box Consultants. She's the author of the book Punk Style and has published widely on the intersection of subculture and music with product development, consumption, design, activism, and authenticity. She has a forthcoming book on punk and its production and consumption aligned with identity. She will introduce today's presenters. Thank you very much.
Hello, welcome. I'm so excited about today's panel. So thank you again for joining us for Conversations on Dress. We do a monthly installment around diversity and inclusivity, and this month is subculture, a topic dear to my heart. So I want to introduce, we have 4 panelists for tonight in alphabetical order. We've got Danny Fuentes. He's the Creative Director and Curator of Lethal Amounts Gallery and Brand Clothing, specializing in subculture and music-driven exhibitions, covering areas of interest such as Genesis P-Orridge, Kembra Pfeffler, Bruce LaBruce, Edward Culver, and highlighting LGBT perspectives in subculture. The gallery has been featured in the LA Times, Art News, New York Times, Huffington Post, and has a large online presence, including a magazine which often is featuring fashion history. Van Dyke Lewis is an associate professor at Cornell University, where among other courses, he teaches fashion theory and oversees the Senior Apparel Design Students Collection. Van Dyke is published widely, including essential texts in the Berg Companion on Fashion and Subculture and on the influence of music in fashion. He studied the intersections of race, fashion, and subculture. Jessica Struble is assistant professor at University of Rhode Island. She teaches research methods and courses on social psychology of dress and appearance. She researches British and American popular culture as a means for fashion and cultural diffusion, examining deviant subcultures and youth cultures, music subcultures, as mechanisms of socialization and resistance to class and social structure. And Theresa Wingy is an associate professor at Michigan State University and the co-director of the Dress and Body Association. Theresa recently presented a keynote for the Manchester Fashion Institute's Face Off Symposium about the costumes worn in the United States insurgents, and has published 2 books thus far, and more forthcoming, I'm sure. One on costuming cosplay, Dressing the Imagination, and another on body style about body modifications, and she's also a designer. It's 2021, subculture has changed in so many ways. Can you tell us, how can someone distinguish between street style and subculture, between fandom communities and subculture?
This is actually something I was just talking about in a class, the difference between street culture and subculture. And the way I discuss it and differentiate between the two is, for me, street style is the style of the people in popular culture. It's what everyday common people are wearing regardless of their subcultural affiliation. The way to describe it is it's casual dress. Originally, street style is something that was worn on the street by urban youth, whereas I see subcultural style as being more niche, that visual or sartorial representation of one's membership and commitment to their specific subcultures.
I would argue that they belong in a similar category, but they are different. So when it comes to subcultures versus fandoms, I contend in my first book, Body Style, that subcultures are these groups that distinguish themselves from mainstream culture as a whole, who do so through a combination of their dress, the activities that they do, their geography, even language and technology or lack thereof. And that would throw punks and cosplay fandoms in the same category as subcultures. What I think is different, though, is how these two groups tend to exist and emerge. Fandoms tend to gather around a focus that is their fan, that they're a fan of. And you can see that in subcultures too. If you think about punk emerging out of maybe the punk music scene, or hip hop emerging out of the hip hop music scene, then you can see that fans can be part of a fandom and be in a subculture. But what I think is distinct about it is that not all subcultures are fans of something. Not all subcultures circulate around something you could be a fandom of. In fact, they might emerge out of things that have to do with things you could be fans of, but not necessarily that's how you identify yourself, such as dancing that might be associated with a subculture. So they tend to be slightly distinct from one another, and it's that focus of the fandom. One of the things I wanted to comment on about what Jessica was saying is that my students and I have discussions lately about street style. They think street style is casual dress with stylized graphics. And we know that anybody over probably 40 years old knows street styles used to be something very different and more closely associated with subcultures. And so as that meaning of street style keeps changing and evolving, I believe it's going to bump back into subcultures. But right now, it doesn't seem to have the same connection to subcultures as it used to.
Yeah, I've been finding that a lot of my students ask me if subculture still exists or is just everybody street style. And then I try to go down the rabbit hole of explaining that. But in explaining that, I talk about people who research it. And Van Dyke, I was thinking maybe you could talk to us a little bit about, do you think you have to be of the subculture to research the subculture to really get it?
I think you do. I think there's a tremendous advantage in being of the culture because you're able to express yourself with nuance and detail, or understand nuance and detail if you're part of it.
Well, I know that when I had studied something similar, I kept having some of my participants in a study say, you get it. And then they would dive deeper. They would tell me stories that they would say that they wouldn't have told someone who didn't know or didn't get it. So it's not that someone from the outside can't study subculture. It's that perhaps when someone is clued into the culture, maybe people will peel back the onion one layer deeper. And I know in my studies, for example, I always hire transcriptionists who know the language, because there's no way that all the slang and the band names and everything can be understood.
So for me, my thinking is that to be in the culture, to be part of the culture, is the best place to be, to have a perspective of the culture. If you don't have that, you don't have nuance. But sure, you can be from any point of view to study the culture. but when you're an insider, you're able to go places perhaps that you otherwise wouldn't. You're able to do two things, and this is why I was flustering. I think there's a difference between lived experience and in sort of inhabiting a space. I think they're different. An example might be someone like Rachel Dolezal, I think her name is, who's this white woman who sort of places herself within Black culture because of tanning or whatever, tablets or whatever. And what she does doing that is she sort of forgets or decides that the experiences of Black people don't matter, because she will never experience the sort of pain and anguish and so on that Black people have experienced. So that becomes problematic. And what the thing I was going back to talk about gender performativity is that we all understand, or some of us, half of us, understand being a woman or being a man. And if you decide to be gender fluid, a woman can become a man become a woman. But you never quite understand, because you've never understood it from birth. So you can begin to understand, but you never quite do. So going back to your question, yeah, I think we need to really consider the lived-in experience.
So that brings me to a question I wanted to ask Danny as a potential expert on. I'm thinking about the idea of that lived experience, and all of us, the five of us here, actively study subculture, marginalized cultures, outliers, outsiders, and yet, even within, especially the history of our scholarship, women, LGBTQI+, the BIPOC, people of color, BIPOC communities, they're marginalized even within subculture, which is marginalized study. And what are some areas you think we could really grow in terms of those studies? Are there some exhibitions you think that just the world needs to see? Or how do you think we can kind of get over that hurdle? I know what I've personally recognized when I do readings and go to exhibitions is women, people of color, and the LGBT community are most represented in subcultural studies when they are specifically about that. Women in punk, right? Gay men in mod, versus just normalizing them within the wider studies. So I was curious your take on that and where you think we could move and shake to improve in that area.
I think just from my experience and what I see, oftentimes the people that are being studied aren't being included. Oftentimes they're still alive, or there's a lineage, and they're almost being fetishized and looked at as like, oh, this is a really interesting specimen. And they just don't really include them in on the dialogue, and it just sort of ends up it becomes somebody's translation of what occurred. I try making friends with everybody who was connected to the things that I appreciate or admire. And if I'm doing an exhibit, I want people that are involved firsthand. If I wasn't able to be a part of it, and I find it interesting in any kind of sense, and I don't always necessarily think I'm studying as much as I'm just interested. I'm interested. I don't really want to. I don't know what the word would be. I'm not necessarily trying to learn at something. It's a weird way of phrasing that, but I'm just interested. I'm not trying to be scholarly about it. I just want to learn. I want to know a little bit more. I know enough to be here, and so I want to know a little bit more. And I think oftentimes people are trying to take the credit for other cultures' work. And so it ends up being this weird way of like saying, like, I present to you this fascinating subject, as opposed to including these people that you're actually studying or discussing or whatever. I don't know. That's something I've noticed. I kind of feel like, I tend to really lean on punk. It's what I grew up on. It's kind of the thing that always, I just always go back to it. It's the thing that I find the most fascinating, and it's for lack of a better way of describing it, it is my culture, at least the generation that I grew up in. And oftentimes when you go look at so-called punk exhibits, I just find it so almost funny. It's very sterilized and just taken almost out of context. And I don't know, I feel like if the people that were in the photographs or being discussed were more actively involved, that would help a lot more. That's just my take on that.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think that a lot of times when things are encapsulated and snapshot, which is not a past tense word, but that context is lost. I know in my studies, I really try to advocate for getting the individual's point of view more than my own, and I try to not study even within subcultures, those that I'm not really a participant in, because I think even within subculture, it doesn't mean we all understand all of them as much as they are a family tree and a concept map and a Venn diagram. But it does seem, if anyone else on the panel wants to comment, in my experience, I feel like there are missing people, missing pieces, missing demographics that there could be so much more scholarship on, so many more exhibits, so many more Instagram feeds, so many more ways to recognize the three-dimensionality of who has participated in subculture and how. And I'm curious, what would you love to see someone start an Instagram feed on, or do a study on, or an exhibition that you feel like would make our what we're studying so much more diverse and more accurately representing, per what Danny's saying, more accurately representing who was actually there?
Well, I just want to jump in with what Van Dyke was saying, and I kind of I agree that being a participant in the subculture does help. It gives you a very different perspective. But I also feel as an outsider, I can offer an objective perspective when studying subculture. Something that when I observe behaviors, okay, I'm not a football hooligan, but when I'm studying football hooligans, I acknowledge and I recognize certain behaviors that they take for granted. And so when things that they would never even, that they don't even acknowledge per se. And so I bring it up and start questioning and start asking the whys, and I can look at it more analytically. So I do think that being an outsider gives me an advantage to an extent to looking at their behaviors, but I'm always going to do it through utilize their voice in explaining it. It's not going to be where I'm like, okay, well, this is entirely my interpretation of it. I'm always going to go back to them and ask them, here's what I observed. Can you explain this? And as I'm writing, I'm going to utilize their quotations and their explanations. And then I'm going to challenge them. Well, what about this? So I think that there are advantages to being an insider and outsider. And as I say, looking as a member of certain subcultures in the past, I do feel that I become a bit proprietal at times when I'm seeing writings about certain things, such as riot girls and rave culture. I'm like, well, no, that didn't happen, because I was there. And so I don't know, it's a very interesting thing, which is why I kind of appreciate what we all study and how we study it. And one thing that I would like to see more of is bringing people in who are part of the culture, who are from outside of academia, and seeing more of it through their eyes and through, have their voice more incorporated into it.
Yeah, and if I can just piggyback on that, I guess I call it collaboration, what Jessica's talking about, right? Like, it isn't just, I collaborate with people in other fields so that I know what sociologists, criminologists, and so on are saying about subcultures, because a lot of fields have tried to co-opt the area and maybe even done a better job than some of us that are coming at subcultures from a dress angle. It has a little bit to do with the history of subcultures in the United States and how originally the research was around immigration and it had racist overtones in it, and it had an agenda, right? That wasn't just sharing research. But what I have found doing ethnography is that I really need, and phenomenology, I really need to collaborate with my participants. And I try to give them voice as much as I possibly can. But I agree with what Jessica's saying, is that having been in a few subcultures gives you a lot of context for how to understand what you're doing and seeing. But there is something to have a trusted insider and to also be able to pull back and be an outsider to point out. For example, I was researching a dance culture in the late 90s, and they were seen as these cute kids with bright hair and just adorable. And when I got into the subculture, I saw a lot of violence. I even got hurt on the dance floor one time by someone they called King. And so I started asking people about it. And when I did, the answers I got back were, oh, we didn't think that was violent, but you're right, he is. And then after a while, I began to see there were a few people that were territorial about dance space. And it wasn't the shared space that really, I was lucky, the manager of the club let me go upstairs and I could look down and see there were cliques that physically owned space in the club. And by seeing that, I was able to figure out where I belonged as an outsider, insider. And I think the key to doing subculture research is almost being almost being a chameleon, where you can go in and out of the subculture to some degree with fluidity, so that you can observe things that you may not see if you're totally on the outside, and so that you can be analytical about the things you're seeing when you're on the inside.
So one thing that what everybody's saying is making me think about is, Danny and I both work in the museum field, and I work both. I teach, research, and work in museums. He works in galleries, museums, and Jess, I think you also work with a collection. And in thinking about this ethnography and how do we tell the right story and how do we include who was actually there and who wasn't there, one thing that I've struggled with is no one keeps the stuff except for a few sentimental people who keep everything. And they've got 400 t-shirts and 1,000 pair of sneakers. But for the most part, subcultural ephemera, the clothes, the shoes, the pins, most people, it's so lived in, it's so lifestyle that they don't keep it. It wears down to the nub, and then you maybe keep one holy t-shirt in a scrap box. But with the exception of those kind of hoarders that we love, where do all of you find, especially with Danny, you're trying to build exhibitions, but then with the rest of you, where do you find your stuff? I'm curious. To do your exhibitions, where do you find the things to do your ethnographies for those of you that study in that way? So, I mean, starting with Danny, but then anybody else, where should someone go to learn how to find archives of subcultural clothes and stuff?
As far as for how I do things, I usually count on the community. People that have been a part of that particular scene. We did an exhibit on a band called Christian Death and Roz Williams, who passed away. And so his belongings were very scattered, and there's 1,000,001 stories connected to that. But, there were people that knew him, people that were a part of that scene, promoters, collectors, and all of the above. And I kind of just called on the community. I just sent the smoke signal. Anybody who has this, anything to do with it, I'd like to see it. We'd love to see if we could display it. And everything turned up, from his personal artwork, his writings, clothing, jewelry, baby pictures, you name it. Honestly, almost anything you could think of that would relate to him. But it gave a really, interesting look at what he means to people, 20 years after his death. It's I don't know. To me, all exhibits, from how I do them, tend to be that way.
Going to the community to find things.
Typically, yeah. And luckily, we've been doing it long enough now that they find me now. So, yeah, I try and just count on other people. Really, I feel like I've never really left my scene, if you will. So, luckily, I know who to dial if I'm trying to uncover some kind of curiosity of some sort. So, yeah, and I'm pretty consistent. So I tend to, not stray too far away from my realm of, knowledge anyway.
Yeah, I mean, part of that speaks to the fact that so many, because these cultures have always been sub and outliers, they're not conventionally in most university archives. They're not in lots of the big museums. They are still in people's basements and owned by communities. Theresa, where do you do your ethnographies? Where do you find things?
So my research has really taken me all over the world. I've recently been doing quite a bit in the Southern Hemisphere, and I definitely look for subcultural exhibits at museums like the Met and the Museum of Popular Culture in Seattle, but also like the Brooklyn Museum has had some amazing exhibits, and I have students or alumni that are there, and so they will like literally tell me, you got to get to New York. There's an exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum. And what I would say is most important about finding those kinds of gems out there is about getting on email lists so that you constantly are being contacted about stuff that's going on. But also, I mean, Danny's got this amazing gallery called Lethal Amounts. I'm going to plug you a little bit here because galleries like that almost have a niche, they are able to reach out to community members, especially if they're positioned geographically well. They can reach out to community members and gather things. That's not as easy for me to do. And so what I actually find myself doing is begging subcultural members that I meet, what can I get that t-shirt that you're wearing right now? How can I get that right now? What can I do? And when I was researching gutter punks, for example, buying them lunch usually got me something. Or buying them another t-shirt got me the t-shirt they were wearing. But I also, over the years, and this is really unfortunate too, because when you do what I'm about to describe, you don't get reimbursed for it in any way. I was in Australia recently for a conference, well, before the pandemic, it's all blur. And at a shop that I went into with Kati Medvedev, I picked up this t-shirt for the Cramps, one of my favorite bands. And it has CBGB on it. And the t-shirt will never fit me. It's too big and whatever. And the guy was like, this isn't the right size for you. I was like, that's not what I want it for. And so I love the fact that I bought it in a boutique in Australia, in Sydney, Australia, next to a Mad Max themed restaurant. The person in there told me everything he knew about the Cramps. I know so much about the Cramps, but I loved hearing him tell me the story about the Cramps. I get stories whenever I tend to pick up clothing like that, especially if they read me differently, because I was at a conference reading me differently than my research. And so when I was in Japan, I found myself in a place called Richard Threads in that back alley in Harajuku that like, you know, you only go back there if you're big old fans. And I was really trying to get to some kawaii, cute little girl clothing up on the second or third floor. And I wound up kind of getting pushed with the crowd into this place called Richard the Thread. He had Nazi paraphernalia in there. He had punk things. There was all kinds of distortion of language. But he told me about the punk scene that was very live in Japan. And that night, I got to go with him and hear some Japanese punk bands. These things, I think we just sort of have to be sponges and be open. If you're dealing with anything that's in contemporary culture, just be open to where the flow takes you. I get that, unfortunately, in academia, we've got to publish. We've got to apply for grants and things, but sometimes really wonderful things come out of just buying a t-shirt. And so, but I agree with what you said, Monica. Unfortunately, we usually get to things when they're not there anymore. I've seen pins worn down to nothing but plastic and paper shreds, and t-shirts I have t-shirts that have holes in them. I'm hoping that all of us that do collect like I do eventually do give to someplace like Danny so that there are archives. But the bigger thing is to ask those that have collections in academia, maybe can make a little space for subcultural stuff. And that way you can actually attract a whole new audience to your collection.
I know at University of Georgia, it's on my mind here of trying to make that little bit of space for lots of new things in terms of representing all different forms of diversity and expanding what's in an archive, subculture, and also racial diversity. I know, Van Dyke, you talked about in our early meeting that studying the intersections of race and subculture have been interesting for you, or if not studying, just conversing about it. And I was thinking about, what kind of misconceptions do people have when they think about race and subculture that you've found when you've studied the topic and written about the topic?
Okay, I've engaged my brain now. I think the first thing is access. Access is sometimes difficult because of everything else that's going on in society. So there's just these misconceptions, and individuals might want to be part of a subculture but find it impossible to even begin to be part of it, or to have friends and so on that are a part of it, just because it's not the thing you do because of your race, and that might be the way you've been brought up, acculturated, that you just don't do that. And because subcultures are or sort of youth subcultures, generally fashion subcultures, generally have a sort of risky side to them as well. They can have, and sometimes that's something you're told you should steer away from. And so it takes, for some people, it takes a lot of will and a lot of guts to become part of a subculture. I think once, I sort of read that just now, and I listed Goth, Skins, BDSM, and others. And I know our world's changed dramatically since, Goths emerged and Skins emerged. BDSM seems to have been here forever. You could say it's a fashion subculture, I suppose. But there's just these expectations that you shouldn't be part of them, and I think that interests me a lot. That part of becoming a member of one of these restricted subcultures is subversive in its own right, and it almost makes you double up as a rebel. So I like that idea.
That's really interesting. Does anyone else want to comment on that?
Well, I know we had this conversation, it was with Van Dyke as well, about how it kind of scares my students. I think is probably the best way to say it when I say one of my research areas is football hooligans and skinheads, and talking about that interface of race and subculture. The immediate knee-jerk misperception is that the skinheads are inherently racist, and then I have to go into the whole diatribe of no, this is in explaining the history and going into all of that. And then, but it really gets us into the discussion of the whole folk devils and moral panics, and talking about how that still exists today. And then, starting with the discussion of the skinheads, but then now in my more recent projects with aging skinheads and aging football hooligans, and talking about that, and that's to me is interesting that they still are very marginalized. And immediately labeled as the racist, and I'm like, but wait, I'm talking to rude boys as well, and they're black skinheads over here, and there's some black hooligans over here that are they're participants in my study, and that really just it shocks them, and I feel that they've and again, I'm going back to some of them. You talked about the intersection of race and subculture, that some of them have just been unfairly labeled that way. There were some organizations, and I mentioned, say the National Front, unfairly took advantage of some very impressionable youth at a very specific point in history, and were pretty much, I would say, preying upon their discontent. And I think what we're looking at more so than race with a lot of these, it's more about social class. And so that gets us into a whole different part of discussion with subcultures, the role of social class in this. And I know that's probably something for later discussion in a different question. But yeah, to me,
has there ever been a really, really good fashion exhibition tracing the complexities of skin culture?
I would love to do one. I would love.
I mean, that questions ago when I was saying what's missing that people don't understand. It's complex. It's intersectional. I mean, skinhead culture would be it reflects with LGBT culture.
Absolutely, that's what I was just going to say.
Culture, and I mean, that would be a hot exhibition that could really be interesting.
Many years ago, when I started this, one of the first skinheads I talked to was a gay skinhead, and that makes people's heads explode when I mention that.
I said it would. I think I think even going further back, one of the interesting things, picking up on your point, was that behaviour, that there's this assumption by the press and others that skinheads behave in a particular way, and I think with all of these subcultures, you as an individual can pick and choose what your behaviour is going to be. And early in when skinheads came about, I think it took about 10 years for them to go from deeply kind of working class dockers and so on in the East End of London to becoming sort of dispersed, the idea of becoming dispersed throughout the home counties and further north in England. And I think one of the things was that the fashion industry picks up on it quite quickly, and so they were beginning to sort of maneuver to make products that were okay for people who weren't perhaps as hardcore to wear those clothes. Although, you know, as you know, it's very label driven. But I think that was interesting that younger people, you know, teenagers and so on, were able to kind of be a softer version, if you like, and so they weren't necessarily taking part of all of those behaviours.
So that I have two questions that kind of relate to that, and it's almost like they're almost a part A and part B of the same idea. And one thing I was thinking, maybe Theresa or Danny could speak to, as Van Dyke was just saying, where styles evolve from. And one thing that is pretty complex is that a lot of subculture styles, like the hippies, have drawn from indigenous peoples of the Americas in their use of beadwork and embroidery, and punks took all sorts of stuff and made ensemble and then destructive and then re-ensemble in that bricolage. But, you know, it's so many subcultures didn't necessarily take yardage, create a brand new thing, but instead, there are some that did, but so many were either appreciating or appropriating or redoing or doing in a new way a culture that already existed. Is that, can either of you talk a little bit about the idea that a lot of subcultural clothes, I mean, or mod was taking a lot from a sort of upper class that wasn't necessarily the class that those young people were in, but they're turning it on its head and taking it on as role play. So where I'm going with this question is to say, what's going on in subculture when they develop a style that they took from something else, but they gave it new meaning? Is it appreciation? Is it appropriation? Is it a whole new thing when a new group wears it? What's going on there?
Well, Joanne Eicher called it cultural authentication, right? When not a subculture, but any group of people borrow something from another culture, perhaps give it a new name and a new meaning in the way that they use it. And so I would say subcultures commonly participate in cultural authentication. But your question about appropriation and appreciation are very interesting. I think they exist on the same continuum, and I think it depends on who's looking at it and the sensitivities of that person or those people looking at it and how they perceive it. I love to give my students examples of what looks like cultural appropriation, and when they hear the whole story, they realize it's actually an appreciation. And so, and how we have been borrowing from indigenous cultures to make punks borrowed from indigenous cultures. I mean, they've been borrowed from a lot. And we see that these indigenous cultures have all been diminished. And so what might eventually remain as an indigenous person myself, one of the discussions in the Ho Chunk tribe is the only thing that will exist of us eventually will be things that youth wear out of rebellion, which they're basically saying subcultures are the only way what we are will exist in the future. Our language will die, our beliefs and ideologies will die, stereotypes will be attached to dress that they take on. And so I think that's, I hope that's cynical. I'm hoping that's cynical. But right at the moment, I would say that that's pretty accurate. There just isn't a voice for Indigenous people, especially in the United States, for example, we're broken into over 600 tribes. And so we have a hard time getting together and saying the same thing. And so in many ways, Black Lives Matter could teach Native Americans how to protest and how to gain political footing today. But I do see that that line between cultural authentication and cultural appreciation gets blurrier and blurrier all the time.
I would agree. I think cultural appropriation and celebration, oftentimes there's a lot of gray area. It's sometimes tough to decipher, but I think you can always tell when someone's authentic and when somebody's just sort of a tourist about it and trying to just absorb it for some sort of surface level meaning behind it. I think oftentimes things that weren't necessarily meant to be appropriations end up being a part of a subculture down the road. I think Gothic, for instance, I think a lot of people ignore the fact that a lot of the Catholic symbols that they're using, oftentimes I feel came from Latins. I think, Death Rock is claimed to have come from Southern California. And I think there's a lot of Latins in Southern California. And I think taking, a First Communion dress, ripping it up and wearing it in public and wearing a giant cross that your mother probably had on the mantle as, jewelry is in some way cultural appropriation, but also at the same time, it's a weird bastardization of something that they, I don't know, it's a part of their, it's a part of their culture, but also they want to say, I also want to leave it behind and make it my own. I don't know. I mean, I think that's something that's left behind in that dialogue. I think a lot of Latins contributed to that Gothic imagery, and I don't think it's oftentimes recognized. I mean, you could talk about Patricia Morrison, Latin, Alice Bagg, Latin. I mean, there's quite a bit, and I think all those really wrote the blueprint of that whole image and style. And I think the branding of it really comes from that sort of Latin Catholic look.
Danny, I just did an interview with someone who was a boutique owner in the early 80s through the early 90s and in LA, and they said a punk-oriented boutique, and they said that they would go get black lacy dresses that were sold in the stores for Hispanic widows and resell them in the punk boutique in like 83, 84. So you are spot on. And yes, there is a real void in exhibitions, in academic literature, in Instagram feeds of the intersectionality between Latinx and subculture. I wish there was a ton more. One thing, if you want to trace it way back, I know you and I were talking about how Los Angeles County Museum of Art, for their 300 years of menswear, did acquire one of the only existing zoot suits. So if we're going to go way back, and it's one of the most expensive museum purchases of clothing for a collection, because usually clothing collections don't have a lot of budget. But that was, I think, really, really important that they found an existing great condition zoot suit and spent way in the double digits, and it's preserving so many intersections of subculture and style and race and class. And so I think if more museums were bold in that way, it would ripple out in a positive way. So Jess, I was thinking maybe you could speak to where that story then goes of when if punks and goths and skaters are all picking up from cultures that maybe they were not engaged with initially, but they're transforming the clothes. What happens when the mainstream transforms subculture clothes? Is it a win? Like, punks have won, we convinced them all blue hair is great, or is it no, the mainstream is missing the marks? But Jess, what happens when subcultural style hits the mainstream? Is it different than when subculture takes from another?
it depends. It depends. Like I said, it depends on the context and depends on how it is appropriated or appreciated. It can be appreciated. You know, we've got Hot Topics, and that, you know, makes it accessible to everybody. It could be a form of flattery for that, and a form of appreciation. It could also take some of these marginalized styles and make them more acceptable. You know, they're no longer marginalized. However, I revert to a lot of the things that are happening in mainstream media that we see in contemporary culture right now in society. And I talking about the Proud Boys and their misappropriation of a lot of different subcultural items. One being my favorite, Fred Perry. And not only Fred Perry, but also the Scottish kilt, you know, things that are being, it's a bit disheartening to see how it is being misused for very negative associations. I think when things are being used positively in a sense of appreciation, I think it's okay, but I think it's ultimately up to the subculturalist. I think that for some people who are subculturalists, when they see their subcultural style being worn by outsiders, you know, people outside the group, it could be a threat to and I have asked them about this and what they feel about it. Call them posers. I hear other names that are less flattering, but they see it as a threat to their authenticity, a threat to their uniqueness. I don't know. Some people are like, whatever trips, you know, whatever they feel like doing. It's ultimately up to the subculturalists to make that decision. But I think it's problematic when you do have the likes of some of these. Again, I talk about the alt-right groups misappropriating some certain things and making it difficult for people such as myself to walk onto a college campus wearing my Fred Perry polo for fear of being labeled a racist. So I don't know. Like I said, it's contextual. So I would love to hear what other people have to say about that.
Yeah, Theresa Van Dyke, did you want to comment on that?
I would echo everything Jessica just said. It's absolutely contextual, and it's really getting problematic. I mean, I watched people this summer, for example, getting angry. More and more things were being worn in the streets by people you didn't want to be associated with, and now you couldn't wear your khakis, or now you couldn't wear that polo, or now you couldn't wear the tennis shoes. And so we've kind of come to this place, and I don't know how tight this is going to wind, but we've come to this place where it's really possibly going to be problematic to wear certain brands, right? And you're going to be associated and affiliated with things. And I can so see this happening to people that are not in this kind of a loop, but they're outside of it and they just happen to wear the wrong thing to the market that day. And so I'm a little worried that we've become I don't know if it's out of cancel culture or just that we're all just so burnt out at this point, but there seems to be this knee-jerk reaction to everything. And it's amazing how hate groups can lay claim to dress and then other people can't wear it, even if it's was hanging in their closet before, you know, that group started wearing it. And so I know we've gotten away from your question a little bit, but I think that is going to impact how things are marketed and how fashion goes forward. I mean, we might all become normcore eventually, although it was very normcore what they were wearing. So,
yeah, I'll follow on from that. Thank you for that, Theresa. I think we were normcore once, and I think subcultures did a lot to give to chill out the mainstream, if you like. That if you go back in time, you know, there was fashion for the upper classes and there was really nothing else. And I think the breakthroughs didn't come because labels suddenly started making cheaper clothes. It came because subcultures started to create their own fashions. And I think that led the way in terms of what happened in terms of people who weren't as sort of switched on. And that actually helped industry to sell fashion to the mass market. So when you think about what is the role of subculture in our society, I mean, that's one of the roles, or one of the eventualities, not a role. I have no problem with it at all, but I echo both of my fellow panelists. I think it depends who picks up on the pieces and what level of respect they offer to the particular subcultural groups.
Yeah, that's like, it seems like every single day online there's some sort of person caught wearing a shirt, and then there's an endless comment thread about, do they actually know who the band was? Have you actually heard of the band? And then there's this moment of trying to authenticate their level of awareness, or just be blasé about, like, I've got no awareness, it was just cool looking. And it's that dialogue I find absolutely fascinating. And so just a few more questions on my plate, because I see that the comment chat room is filling up, so I want to give other people a chance. But thinking about that representation, what about where it goes into representation in film, in TV, in costume? For anybody on the panel, what are some performances you've seen that have represented subcultures, dress, and an embodiment of style correctly? What should we turn to if we're looking on Netflix, or we're going to go to a movie, or call it out? Like, who's just been terrible as well, and just you see something and you're like, that isn't how it should look. So we have so many people in CSA that are interested in costume and theater and film. What's happening? Is subculture represented well or not in performance?
Well, I teach a class on culture and dress, and I definitely take them around the world to meet different cultures, but I really want them to realize that there are cultures right here under their nose that they maybe haven't noticed or even avoided. And so subcultures become a real focus of the class. And students usually respond pretty well to it, but their ideas about subcultures, especially ones that existed before they were born, are very skewed. And so I love to show them films like Quadrophenia or SLC Punk. There's that infamous scene where Steve-O is in the mall and he is talking about a mall punk versus an American punk, and he makes the claim that it's not such a big difference between the UK or the USA and who started it and who didn't start it. But what's more important is pay attention to these people that are poser punks, right? And so my students watch that, and then I have them watch at least one part of Decline of Western Civilization so that they get this notion of how does this, even this more accurate version, how does that play out when we look at subcultures? But I think TV series probably do it the worst. We've had good series like Freaks and Geeks, for example, but they go away very fast. And that is because it's difficult to get a broad audience on TV once a week and to stay tuned in to something that is not accurate. You will have different generations watching, and one generation will realize this isn't accurate, this isn't how it looked, this isn't what it was, and they pull away. And I do believe even young people can pick up on disingenuous kind of ideas of representation, whether it be dress or the activities that they were involved in. I blame a lot of reality TV and the writer's strike in the 90s for causing all kinds of trouble, from Trump all the way to MTV not playing music. But reality TV gives us a look at what we think, what students in particular tell me is real world. And I have to dissect that and help them understand that this is very constructed, and even the dress is picked. You're going to be on TV. And so even when they're dressing down, they're not really dressing down. And so it leaves us with these incomplete ideas, almost caricatures of subculture members. And it's really problematic, and it needs to be unpacked. So I try to do that with my students, but it is really interesting when one of them walks into the class and they're wearing an Iron Maiden t-shirt, and I go, "Hey, Eddie, I was at that concert." And they're like, "Who's Eddie?" And I'm like, "Oh dear, have you ever heard them?" And they haven't. So, and it leads to this very interesting conversation. Inevitably, I pull up a YouTube video, they're horrified, and I never see the t-shirt again.
Has anyone else had, just thinking of this, and then I wanted to just ask one more question and go over to the chat room, but have any of the other three of you noticed a really great representation where the costumer just knew their stuff or really like bad representation?
I like
Well,
quadrophenia.
You like quadrophenia?
Quadrophenia.
Van Dyke, what were you going to say too?
yeah, I was going to say particularly my favorite shot in the movie is the harder they come in when they're in the record shop and the guy in the tracksuit starts dancing.
Yes.
I think they got
Danny,
it spot
did you have
on.
an example of a really good one?
I kind of like what was it called? It was Boy George's biopic, Worried About the Boy. I think that depicted punk into New Romantic quite accurately, but I think he was actually involved, so that might be the reason
Boy
why.
George's autobiography is, I have said to so many people that Boy George's autobiography is one of the best fashion books of about the 70s and 80s. Until it gets to the Culture Club part, it's really, really amazing, talking about Con and Bell and all the stores of that era. And Quadrophenia, Roger Burton, who has the Contemporary Wardrobe Archive in London, outfitted Quadrophenia, and as well as the Brian Jones movie, I think it was called Stoned. And so Roger Burton he's in my first book. He put out a book of his archive, the Contemporary Wardrobe, and it's really great. And that's part of the reason that it's mostly Quadrophenia. It looks amazing because he kept all the real stuff, which is so rare. We need more people to keep the real stuff. So I'm just going to ask one more question really quickly, just a one-line answer. Can everyone just say, like, if someone wants to read something awesome on subculture and fashion that was just really well done, one article, or go to one exhibition catalog, or one Instagram feed, one book, for people in the audience, if they want to just have one great reference for tomorrow, what would you each say?
I have to plug my Lethal Amounts Instagram.
Okay, your magazine is great. Okay, so we got one. I just plugged Roger Burton's book, so.
Pretty and Punk by LeBlanc. It's
yeah,
yeah,
right here.
it's
I'm in my office, so I have
it's an oldie but a goodie. It's one of the few books that looked at women in a movement that was dominated by males, and they really do have an amazing presence. And so I thought she did a really good job of capturing their voices. And they aren't first generation punks; they're part of the second generation of punks. So I think that she does just an amazing job, and it's out of Canada. We don't have a lot of subcultural work coming out of Canada.
Good call. So Justin Van Dyke, if you're going to plug one thing that somebody could just really learn about subculture in a fun way, something well done.
Usually I'd say David Muggleton's Inside Subculture, but this is my new favorite as an aging subculturalist myself. If you want to read about old people that are subculturalists, this is a great book. This is David Bennett and Paul Hodkinson's book on aging and cultures.
Yes. Van Dyke, which one would you say somebody should grab tomorrow or go online?
I have to go back to source and say Dick Hebdige, Subculture, the Meaning and Style.
I see what's looking at me right in the chat room is someone put Viv Albertine's memoir, which is my favorite book of the pandemic. Viv Albertine from the Slits wrote just such a wonderful archive memoir about so many things about being a woman in punk, but it has tons and tons of clothing content, and it's really, really great. For exhibitions on subcultural dress, it's a long question about who curates them and who really is the audience. You know, we talked about the clothes and who should be wearing what. And so if we're doing an exhibition about subcultural dress, who should we be aiming it for? And so how would we contextualize the narrative? Who do we hope comes? Like, I guess starting with Danny, but really anybody.
Yeah, I think that's super challenging, at least coming from where I do things. I think it's so internal what I tend to do that there is a little bit of an attitude of gatekeepers, and people don't want to teach others about things that they consider holy and sacred. So it can be a little bit of you got to place it in a really good position of where anybody can take a look at it without it feeling like it's being exploited. And hopefully that's what we do. I feel like that's what we do. But I think it's a challenge. Honestly, I don't know who's going to go to the Met to look at an exhibit on punk clothes. Probably not punk rockers. Maybe people that were a part of it to see what it felt like, to be in a museum. But I don't really think punk rockers need to be taught about punk fashion. And so it just gets a little bit weird at that point.
Another one about authenticity. How do we sort of narrow in on what is authenticity and in subculture, and how can we contextualize that and understand that about the style? And that it sort of goes back to thinking about how the clothes were developed, and then again, this proprietary, who gets to wear them, what makes a subcultural style, the wearer of it, authentic, and what makes for, as Jess used the word pose, or that some people bandy about. How can you tell the difference?
So I'm going to kind of flip that question on its head.
And I paraphrased the question, but
not too long ago at a South by Southwest festival, Bruce Springsteen did like a keynote speech about post-authenticity. And I happened to be writing an article about subcultures that emerge online and what happens to them. Do they stay online? Do they get this hybrid identity? And his discussion of post-authenticity was fascinating. It blew me away. He really thought about how the internet and social media and us having cameras in our phones have made it possible to capture any moment, digitally change it. And this was before the fake it videos and things were out, but how we have the ability to change these things and assume identities that aren't tangible in the real world. And because of that, he says there's no way, it doubles back on itself, and there's no way to ever be in a place to know that what you're seeing or what you're experiencing is authentic and not constructed in some way. And I thought that was really fascinating. Never thought Bruce Springsteen would ever teach me anything, but I went into reading it. And it, by the way, it's online because they capture everything and they translate it into text, so you can listen to it or read it. I went into it thinking there's no way that you can get past authenticity. Like, how does that happen? But he really does make a very cogent argument about this. And so I would push back a little bit and just say maybe we no longer know for 100% that anything's authentic. And for me personally, when I'm interviewing subculture members, I try to take them at their word. I was criticized harshly in China when I gave a presentations on zokus, which are subcultural groups in Japan. And that word, when you translate it, means tribe. But that is what they call themselves. And so I used that word, and an anthropologist ripped me to shreds. And I said, I appreciate what you're saying, but I'm always going to use the words and the terms and the identities that my participants give me. That's authentic to them. So even if you're
there's
not,
a question in here I'd like to have as a follow-up to what you just were talking about, and because I want to address another person's question of regarding what is authentic and exhibitions and scholarship, taking what you're talking about and kind of piggybacking this new question. If someone isn't in academia, they're not a professor, or they don't own a gallery, they're not a curator, they're not but someone loves subculture, they're into it, it's their world, and they know a lot about it, how can they get involved? And especially diversifying the content, what are good ways? There's so much gatekeeping. We were talking about, we want to expand all of the studies and exhibitions and conversations around subculture, but we all know that the museum profession and the academic profession have just layers of gatekeeping to even get the jobs. So one of the things to definitely consider is what are all the ways to do work in this area, do cool, great, smart work, and not be in academia and museums.
Well, I'm not sure if there shouldn't be some training, because I don't think you can just go in and look at a subculture and really make sense of it. So I think there has to be some training, because I was talking earlier about nuance and so on, that you might miss some of those things. So I think this is an interesting point, because I think we don't offer enough in terms of academia, in terms of opening up to other groups, part-time courses and so on, or other constituencies who are not full-time students. So we perhaps should offer those sorts of things, or online methods courses, so that people can, even people in the group, can go in and think about and talk about what they do in their groups. I was thinking on the point, the first question, the question before this was about authenticity, and I was thinking about the genesis, when the thing starts, and who better to report back about authenticity than somebody on the inside when it starts. Because I've been having a kind of crisis about what has happened to hip hop. Hip hop in the 70s, early 80s, I understood. What it's become now, I'm not sure if it is authentic anymore. It's become something else. But I really like the idea of and who's got the time to track something like that from the 70s to the 2000s, except people on the inside.
Does anyone else want to comment on other ways, just ways people could get involved, be part of the solution of creating more content, regardless of whether they're in academia or museums?
I would say partner and collaborate with people that work in academia. We are very limited in our resources and what we can do, and sometimes partnering with community members can give you access to things you didn't even know existed. I know here in Michigan, there are storefronts that are going out of business, or they're for whatever reason, it's a neighborhood that hasn't quite come back fully, and they want things in the storefront window. And so I definitely have seen some innovative exhibitions happen in storefront windows just by community members. And so I think that collaborating with academics can benefit both sides. But I would agree with what Van Dyke said. Without any training, and without collaborating, you're bound to make mistakes you wouldn't have to make. And so just by reaching out, I think you might be surprised how much you can mutually benefit one another.
I see some comments in the chat room say good blogs, podcasts. There's lots of new ways that we can get content out there and include a lot more voices in the conversation. We started the conversation talking about definitions, or loose constructs of definitions. What's fandom? What's street style? What's subculture? And now circling toward the 5-10 minutes from the end here, there's some new questions about that. And so thinking about, Denise had asked, what would you call the Proud Boys, or a group of that ilk? What kind of category do some of these fall within? Is that fandom? Is that subculture? Is there a new term that hasn't come up yet?
Right, and I think I wrote back in response to that. The way I describe things like that with political undertones, I consider them movements. I would not call them a subculture. I don't want to give them any sort of legitimacy, to be quite honest. But no, I call it a movement, and I'm hoping it's one that moves far away. Yeah, no, and I think that's a really good question, because there are some very close ties to all these. Whether it's a lifestyle, that's another one that gets thrown out there. Is this a scene? Is it a lifestyle? Is it a subculture? Yeah, is it fandom? Is it a counterculture? And then you get into the nuances of counterculture, street culture, music subculture, and then getting into all of that. To me, it's fascinating to talk about. But yes, Proud Boys, I would call them a movement. So that's just my 2 cents. If anybody wants to chime in.
I will say that they're not a fandom by the basic definition of what are they a fan of, right? I don't know that there's a thing that, I mean, they are coming together around a shared idea. And so they share an ideology. I would argue they are a subculture by the most academic basic definition of it. I agree with Jessica, though, it gives them some validity that you almost don't want to give them. But I think eventually, like 50 years from now, maybe even as soon as 20 years from now, hopefully we move beyond this and we can look back on it and not romanticize it or nostalgia or anything, but look back and see that maybe there was something within these groups that had merit to look at. I think sometimes if we ignore things that are too painful or hateful, then we are bound to have more problems. Like, I'm not trying to create some comparison to something in Germany once upon a time, but it probably is a good idea if we don't totally turn a blind eye. And if we actually look it right in the face and keep an eye on it, maybe it won't get bigger than what it is. And maybe some intellectual thought on it can start to dismantle and untangle it.
Well, so one more question about kind of shaking out these definitions, and maybe this is a good one to end on. We started on how do we even define this panel tonight, and maybe if we sort of end on it. There was another question about can you kind of split out street style from subculture, because subculture is often dressed for resistance and street style is not within that idea?
I guess I disagree with that kind of notion about subcultures. They don't necessarily, we used to think that a long time ago when subculture research started in the 1920s in the United States, it was all about looking for the deviant, the criminal, the moral panic. The UK, one of the reasons they approach subcultures differently is there's almost curiosity and a celebration of these groups that emerge from normative or mainstream culture. And so I don't know that a subculture has to be in resistance or counterculture. I think that they can exist without those kinds of things and still stand distinct from the culture as a whole. I'm not sure that what street style is now is going to give us a clear idea of what it's been. I just wrote an article for the Routledge Street Culture Handbook, and one of the things, I was working with criminologists, and their take on what street style is gang dress. So it really is about perspective, right? And so I had to sit there with all these criminologists who I was the only female in the group, and try to have discussions with them where no, street style isn't just gang dress. So it's kind of interesting. I have got students who think street style is casual dress with interesting graphics, and I've got criminologists who think street style at the same time think street style is gang dress. And it's really problematic. And then what people actually know about dress, like what criminologists think they know about gang dress, is not accurate. And so there's a lot of complications tied up in this, where I really used to love the term street style, but when I hear it now, I just panic because I don't know what the person means when they say it. And I don't think it's tied to subcultures in a great way anymore. And it isn't necessarily leading to fashion that comes from that either. So there's just seems to be, we're in a transition phase right now, and I'm not really sure what it's eventually going to mean. But currently, it's pretty murky.
And so does anyone else want to comment on whether you think that street style is a dress of resistance? I'm sorry, subculture, dress of resistance?
Yeah, I think subculture is really about this formation of self, visual formation of self. And with that, you have agency. I think with street style, you don't necessarily have agency. And I think it's not, the ideology is not as clear, and often it's simply in the appearance, and it's open to as I sort of commented before, it's open to being sort of countermanded by commercialism, and they can quickly get on board and start to direct it. And we saw this with when sneakers started being worn, for instance, regularly on the street, not just for sports, and how there was this incident in London, I call it an incident event, when the kids decided they were not going to buy expensive sneakers anymore because they thought the brands were ripping them off, and so they decided to buy simply white ones that were cheap. And then within months, suddenly they were expensive, and they were not necessarily a subculture. They were, just a generally agreed street sort of style. So I think they're a little bit different. And the thing about law enforcement is, yeah, they think they know what people wear, and they think they know why they wear it, and often wildly wrong. But it doesn't take them long to get round to attempting to figure it out. But I think it's usually incorrect. So yeah, these are quite deep questions, actually.
So I really want to thank my panelists, our panelists. This is a really engaging conversation. Thank you so much for your time. And the audience, we want to thank you so much as well for your great questions.
And we also thank you all for attending. Thank you to today's speakers for their time and efforts. Special thanks to the organizers who collaborated on this panel, including our moderator, Dr. Monica Sklar, Costume Society of America board member, Graham Wetzbarger, who runs all of our virtual content, CSA VP External, Adam McFarlane, the CSA office with Kate Ahn, and Kristen Miller-Zone, who is the Executive Director of CSA. Please follow the Costume Society of America on Facebook and Instagram to make sure you hear about all the upcoming episodes of Conversations on Dress, and consider donating to CSA's website to the organization to support this and other programming. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful night.